Please welcome Rip Rapson, President and CEO of the Kresge Foundation.
I have no idea what that just meant, but good morning, everyone. We just couldn't be more excited to have every important person in the United States here at this convening. This is really quite extraordinary. And to gather in what is unquestionably the most dynamic, exciting, vibrant city in America. Oh, I just realized some of you aren't from Detroit, are you? I'll tone it down. Many years ago, the late, great jazz drummer Art Blakey was driving the back roads of Louisiana to a performance, only to get stuck behind a funeral procession, and he can't really get by until the service is done. So he gets out of his car and he saunters over, and eventually the preacher asks if anyone has anything to say about the deceased. Just complete silence. Nothing. Awkward silence. So Blakey jumps in and says, well, if no one wants to speak about the departed, I'd like to say a few words about jazz. So this morning, I'd like to say a few words about philanthropy. Because as partners in your work, it's probably only right that we try to explain ourselves. 100 years ago, Sebastian Kresge created a foundation in his name with the mission to promote human progress. When one's founding documents allow such sweeping discretion, it's tempting to cast your net broadly, to sidestep the need to choose among countless worthy causes. It's tempting, but it's ill-advised. Spreading philanthropic resources too thin causes us to flow, amoeba-like, from one urgency to another. The challenge is to select a point of view, to shape where, how, and to what we direct our resources, and not just our endowment, but our attention, our credibility, and the dedication, the learning, and the creativity of our people. Over the 18 years in which I've had the privilege of serving as president of the foundation, we've come to an understanding about how to meet that challenge, engaging tasks that we do well and calling on tools that we use with skill, which we blend, stack, and combine with the freedom that is a unique privilege of philanthropy. Our grant and investment dollars align with, fortify, and give credibility to everything the foundation does. And yet, grants alone are insufficient to the full realization of our purpose, particularly when viewed in the context of the vast dollars available to the public and private sectors. If we're going to contribute to social progress, therefore, we have to embrace moving into lanes that are difficult, if not impossible, for the public and the private sectors to occupy. That's been demonstrated time and time again as we've sought to adapt to the extraordinary cycles of uncertainty and disruption that have washed over Detroit in the last 2 decades. The ravages of the Great Recession and the housing foreclosure crisis of 2008-2009, the existential threat posed by the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, the wholesale reinvention of neighborhood revitalization tools in the bankruptcy's aftermath, the dizzying dislocations in public health, small business viability, and daily life occasioned by COVID, the searing energies of racial justice and reconciliation following George Floyd's murder. During the depths of Detroit's challenges, someone sent me a note suggesting that I should think really hard about whether the following quotation reflected the reality facing the city. That quotation read, "More than any other time in history, humankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to utter despair and hopelessness, the other to obliteration of all we hold dear. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose wisely." Ouch, I never did really figure out who sent me that note, but we in Detroit did have the wisdom to choose wisely and correctly. Neither the first path nor the second, but a third, one premised on the aspiration of reimagination, renewal, and hope. As we set out on that path, we grounded our work in 6 roles that have come to define our approach, not only in Detroit, but also in the other cities in which we are engaged. Let me just say a brief word about each. First, table setting. We can convene community members around the kind of gnarly, long-term issues the public and the private sectors won't or can't address. helping set a table designed to enable a community to overcome stubbornly resistant civic inertias and cut new channels that give form to systems that didn't exist before. Second, capacity building. We can lend support to the mechanisms by which citizens become well-organized where they live, valorizing the power of people, places, and ideas that have been cast to the margins of our economy and our politics, injecting local voices into processes that are often too hardwired to marginalize them, building new social connective tissue, augmenting resident-based planning and investment tools. Third, risk mitigation. We can peel away the first layer of risk in critical fiscal transactions outside the comfort zone of public and private sector actors. In essence, we can serve as society's passing gear, helping to propel society beyond its fixed and safe positions toward enduring long-term social change. And when we de-risk transactions, we demonstrate that money can move outside the arteries of an unresponsive market, setting in motion a flywheel in which capital flows with a different valence to low-income and low-wealth communities and families. Fourth, we can serve as a guarantor of value. We can underwrite public goods and spaces that signal to private markets that these are places and activities capable of anchoring a community's sustained long-term health and stability, whether that's a public market, a riverfront, a light rail line, or a new cradle-to-career educational campus. Fifth, ground truthing. We can offer knowledge of the local circumstance to those not familiar with the city to help them determine how they might best invest their time, their talent, and their resources. And we can remind them that the challenges of local change-making are never rooted in hermetically sealed, singular set of causes, but instead reflect complex, interbraided systems ricocheting against one another over the long term. The challenges are not like an infection cured by an injection, but rather like a persistent condition requiring continual care and management. And sixth, civic stewardship. We can invest in strengthening and sustaining the fragile civic and cultural ties that help bind a city. This means investing in organizations that serve as our society's moral thermostats, organizations that activate in the presence of suffering, injustice, or exclusionary behaviors. These 6 roles have become far more than a neat and tidy rubric capable of housing the wide spectrum of Kresge activities during a tumultuous period of Detroit's history. They've instead redefined what we seek to accomplish wherever we worked and how. Our experience, moreover, underscores that these roles activate with the greatest potency when deployed in combination, mixing and matching, blending and layering, proportioning and sequencing according to the circumstance. It is, in essence, reverse engineering, clarifying what we want to accomplish, then working backward to identify, assemble, and coordinate the right players equipped with the right tools, applied in the right doses, in the right order, and at the right pace. And only then, do we forge a truly effective, equitable, and accountable civic problem-smashing machinery. A machinery that embraces, but that is not limited to, the prerogatives of our friends in City Hall or state government, that is not subordinated to the private interests of corporations, that is not unduly dependent on a philanthropic sector with only the most tenuous claims to democratic legitimacy. Instead, it is a machinery drawing strength from all parts of civil society, working in a mutually reinforcing way to advance the common good. So it's in this spirit that the Kresge Foundation Centennial both impels us to reflect on the path we've traveled and invites us to interrogate how best to move forward. As Shakespeare reminds us, the past is prologue. The Centennial has been anchored by a series of convenings that have sought to build to this summit. Convenings about the intersection of community development, health, and climate action, about prioritizing environmental health and racial equity and transportation infrastructure investments, about positioning equity-based strategies at the core of statewide economic development, about national models of cradle-to-career education. These convenings have made clear that philanthropy's role is not to stand outside the fence line of civic decision-making and waiting for the perfect, safe moment to deploy our resources. It is instead to get right into the mix, embracing our uniqueness while recognizing our limitations, working in an integrative, cross-disciplinary way without becoming paralyzed by complexity, recognizing the imperative of patiently chipping away at the intractable without avoiding the urgent, becoming comfortable with change that is organic but that can lead to trigger points that enable qualitative leaps forward by inspiring a wholesale rethinking of urban systems. Now, all of that's a bit high level, and that's why we've structured the conversations over the next couple of days to take bead on 4 overarching and wickedly complex issues that cities of all sizes and shapes will have to mud wrestle if they're going to make the kind of progress to which we all aspire. First is racial equity and reparative community development. In our first plenary, our speakers will excavate past injustices that continue to shape our cities today and discuss vehicles for advancing genuine healing through greater spatial, social, and economic equity. Second is climate change's centrality to every dimension of community life. Our second plenary will reflect on the intersection of environmental resilience, health, and community development. Third is people-centered economies. The third plenary will explore how cities can usher in people-centered economies, equitable wealth creation, and multi-generational economic mobility. And fourth is the power of cultural placemaking and placekeeping. Our final plenary will invite us to consider how arts, culture, and design can tap the power of a creative problem solving that calls on community wisdom, intergenerational exchange, and respect for difference. But before I turn you over to those themes, though, I want to offer a slight provocation. In a brief 12-year span at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, our country saw the emergence of 8 technologies that altered the fundamental arc of urban America: indoor plumbing, central heating, electrical generators, steam frame construction, elevators, telephones, automobiles, and subways. One could certainly argue that 100 years or so on, electronic, digital, and machine learning revolutions have given that arc one more dramatic upward pull. But what would happen? What would happen if we superimposed a lens that had to do more with the software than the hardware, more to do with the social determinants of change than with the technological determinants of change? You know, as we contemplate what we learned about how the pandemic strained the essential fabric of a society that needs to be held together by caring and compassion, how the economic downturn cast in bright relief implications of unforgivably vast wealth inequities, how the persistent drumbeat of racial violence reset the terms of engagement around issues of reparative racial justice and healing, how a changing climate unmasked the existential climate crisis that too many are content to shove into a closet for consideration sometime later, but not now. As we contemplate those tectonic forces, it becomes clear that perhaps the innovation in thinking and acting that we truly require lies in people solutions, not technocratic ones. Because below the surface of the challenge that cities face lies a complex mosaic of hope, ideas, skills, and assets that continues to shape the conditions for reimagination. Diverse subcultures, historical legacies, and future aspirations colliding and recombining in infinitely varied and imaginative ways to redefine and recast a new arc of equity and justice. Let me suggest just 2 quick examples of how those energies might contribute to a new people-centered urban operating code. First is the emergence of a reimagined municipal pluralism. Now, our elected officials hold the legitimacy that comes with an election certificate and legally prescribed mechanisms of accountability. And yet, given the forces I ticked off just a moment ago, that means something quite different in 2024 from what it did in 1990 or even 2010. Let me be clear. We simply cannot do without an able, committed public sector, no matter its shortcomings. In even the worst of cases, we cannot relinquish the expectation that our elected representatives will crystallize and articulate public priorities and pursue responsible and responsive public spending. But Yogi Berra once observed, even Napoleon had his Watergate. Now, I actually have no idea what that really means, but I do think it has some bearing on this issue. Actually, I think what it does mean is that the basic civic calculus falls apart if people start believing that government is bogarting its power and that it is no longer working in the broad interest of society. In the eyes of too many of our citizens, budgets are forged based on the easy convenience of short-term transactionalism, not on the long-term imperatives of civic good. In the eyes of too many, thoughtful discourse is being strangled by incessant and petty partisan bickering. And in the eyes of too many, the necessity of facing down difficult decision-making is being subverted by opportunistic gesture politics. That suggests that in order to activate community priorities, we need a new municipal pluralism, in which the community's impulses toward opportunity, healing, and justice are translated and animated by distributive authorities and responsibilities. Think CDFIs, civic conservancies, community development organizations, nonprofit service providers, block clubs, mutual assistance associations, individual residents. A network of capacities and relationships designed to ensure that residents can participate meaningfully in the decisions and resource allocations that shape daily life in this nation's neighborhoods. A second element of that new human-centered municipal operating code will be reimagination of community ownership structures. The construct is certainly not new. Indeed, American democracy has, from its inception, assumed that citizens who are property owners would be likely to participate more fully in the maintenance and the perfection of our democracy. Unfortunately, of course, that mandate has, for the better part of 300 years, failed utterly as applied to non-white Americans. And yet, despite the extraordinary challenges that people with low incomes face in securing the capital to invest in long-term wealth building, we've witnessed remarkable innovation. Community land trusts, commercial cooperatives, property ownership by neighborhood residents, and on and on. It's long past time that community ownership migrates to its next generation of scale and impact. In the words of Elwood Hopkins, from whom we'll hear in just a couple minutes, the time has come to build an American ownership society. We can start by building on what we have, expanding the reach of land trusts, the commercial cooperatives, the neighborhood entrepreneurs. But we can bridge to something even more ambitious and potentially far-reaching. Consider for a moment the enormous collective potential lodged in a trusted set of civic players able to aggregate small investments from their neighbors into a neighborhood investment trust. For example, if a network of Detroit churches with 10,000 members was able to raise $500 from each of their congregants, they might use that $5 million to purchase properties and give each of those 10,000 residents a fractional ownership of an entire district, an ownership interest that would grow wealth over time. The path is clear. We can move from boutique practice to accelerated adoption, translating experiences from one community to another through national networks and communities of practice. There's a traditional Asian saying that goes, "Everything rests on the tip of intention." It implies a very close relationship between outcome and motivation. And I've always thought that this applies not only to individuals, but to institutions as well. In the world of community service, all our institutional values and principles grow directly out of our fundamental intention to advance the health and well-being of others. We shift and adjust, we expand and we contract, we assess and we respond, but we always keep our original intention in clear view, spurring our dreams of new and better ways to serve. When President Obama spoke with me at our Kresge Centennial in June, he observed that younger generations of leaders today possess a tremendous sense of social responsibility and an intense commitment to advancing racial equity, economic justice, and environmental sustainability. But he also expressed deep concern that this idealism, this dream of new and better ways to serve, is paradoxically riding side by side with an absence of hope, a lost excitement about the art of the possible. It would be sadly ironic if those of us gathered here today, those of us who consider ourselves to be urban practitioners, were to lose our own sense of visionary idealism. I hope the conversations over the next few days will serve to underscore that we have a vital role to play in addressing President Obama's concern. That we can affect whether the landscape we bequeath to our children will be based on impulses of compassion and service or constructs of narrow self-interest. Whether it will usher rhythms of equity, fair play, and opportunity, or fall back on the halting steps of differential treatment and privilege for the few. Whether it will look toward enlightened stewardship of the public commons or fuel a feverish rush to privatize and individualize our shared heritage. In a word, let's use our time together to fire our imagination to conceive of a bolder, more equitable urban trajectory. And I'm optimistic we can do that. And under the circumstances, it strikes me that being anything other than an optimist is a profoundly unproductive use of our time. So thank you. Let's go be productive.